Hello, welcome to the next episode of our movie discussion podcast where we discuss whatever film we want. This week we are discussing Sin City and Whiplash. And also, I forgot to say this as well last time. I had to put this disclaimer in the title, but I'll just say this now. We are going to be extensively spoiling both films as well. So if you're interested in watching them and we both recommend them, just watch them before you listen to this podcast, or just watch it if you have already seen it. Okay.
Okay, with the spoiler stuff out of the way,
Yeah.
the warning. Shall we start on Sin City?
Yeah. Sin City. It came out in 2005. It, it's a bit hard to summarize the plot because it's
It's
got
an
like
adaptation of
multiple
a Frank
different.
Miller comic. It follows multiple characters as they go through, Basin City, and they go about their general duties. It's very much a noir story, so it follows, the sort of similar character archetypes that you'd expect. So you've got, the betrayed cop whose personal life has been made into a misery, but still just trying to save that one person. Got the big bruiser type who's done wrong in his life, but fell in love with this one woman, risks it all for her. You've got a murderer trying to escape his ways, but ultimately not being able to get away from his nature. And I think that's the main characters covered.
And you've got a couple of like bookending scenes. I want to specify character names. Marv is the bruiser. Hartigan is the cop. And I assume you're referring to Dwight as the murderer?
Yes, Dwight, yeah.
So yeah, this movie is based on the comic book series. And what's notable about Jack is that he absolutely loves comic books, like he like collects them. And that's different to me because although I've definitely read my fair share of like comic books, I'm not like hugely into them or anything. But I have actually read a couple of the Sin City books. I've read The Hard Goodbye, which is the Marv story in this one, and I've read A Dame to Kill For, which is the biggest story in the next Sin City film. But for the most part, I can kind of say that this is definitely one of the most accurate comic book adaptations that I've seen.
Well, I think
It's
what helps
almost
with
shot
that
for shot.
it is pretty much shot for shot. I think what really helps with that is Frank Miller was really, really involved in the creation process, and
Mhm.
he helped direct the film. I'm pretty sure he helped write it as well.
I don't think that there's even a screenplay credit because I don't think there was. Well, there was a need to write the script, obviously, but I don't think any of the dialogue was changed. I don't think the stories were changed at all. I think the stuff at the beginning and the end was maybe original.
Oh, I'm trying to remember now.
Yeah,
I'll
or
maybe
it could have just been the ending that was that was original when the beginning wasn't, or something. But regardless, like, so it's kind of it's like the best like kind of precursor to stuff like 300 or stuff like Watchmen, because those films not only utilized a similar like kind of ultra violent, very like special effects heavy kind of aesthetic, but they were also very like in terms of the translation from comic book to screen.
I must admit, though, I do think that Sin City kind of has an edge over those films as adaptations because they work. I think it works inherently more cinematically than a few more
Hmm.
do. It is grounded in such a almost a movie specific kind of genre because it is very much noir. And while you've got the hard boiled novels that kind of were precursors to noir, quite the same thing. And I think, especially with Sin City, I think it is the perfect representation of Frank Miller's writing style because
Hmm.
everything about the film just screams this almost this black and white thinking, this very bleak sense of hope that gets intermittently crushed and brought back and problematized throughout the film. You've got these incredibly stoic, aging, broken characters doing the last thing they know how to do. I think it's probably the pinnacle of Frank Miller's writing, the good and the bad.
I think that this is easily like the best film that he's had his like name attached to. It's also an extremely like aggressive film. The reason why like comic books often make for like big blockbusters is because like they often have like wild crazy visuals. There's a lot of big outlandish action in them. And oftentimes that gets translated into a comic book, and that's very much the case for like the Sin City books. But also the thing that kind of appropriate for a film is because not only is there like way more action than you'd see in like a typical like noir movie or like a 40s noir film, but this is also an incredibly violent film as well. It's the kind of thing that like that you can really emphasize and really do well in a film, like more so in a comic book, you know? Obviously in a comic book you can show violence, but in a film you can really like make the audience wince and cringe. And Sin City is probably the most like I think it might be the most violent comic book adaptation I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of like comic book movies, and I can't think of that many that are more violent than this one.
No, there's one or two that I would probably say would be contenders, but I think, you know, especially with the sound design and the violence of this film, I think sound design is something this film really does have going for it. And I'm not even talking about the visuals yet because they deserve like a much longer discussion.
Mhm.
But the sound, you know, the sound design, the way you do get these very very wet, crunchy sounds, and you know everything just feels hard and liquid because you've got that bone crunching. The every punch seems to just echo ever so
Mhm.
ever so slightly. You've got the wet sounds of blood coming off or muscle.
There are so many scenes where people just get punched in the face as well. Like sometimes out of nowhere, and sometimes like there are so many like torture bits. Sometimes the violence is outright like cartoonish as well, you know, in some scenes. But it's just so like brutal and so like consistent that almost after a while it turns darkly comedic. But there are only maybe a couple of scenes that are genuinely like played for laughs. But the film has kind of earned the right to play some of its violence for laughs because for the most part, it takes itself like very seriously.
Yeah, I do think it is an immensely serious film. I think captures what neo noir tries to be quite well. It adds that extra level of violence. It takes away the suggestion of the original noir while keeping the
Yeah.
visual style. And I want to just have a moment to talk about the visuals because I
Mhm.
think this is one of the more visually unique films I've seen in a while. I think the closest thing that I would compare it to in terms of like a color palette style would be Schindler's List. Oddly,
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, I get that. The selective use of color, but mostly black and white.
I mean, obviously it looks very very different, but you know, it's the same sort of technique. And I like the fact that in the film, you know, it's the reds or the yellows that are highlighted. So it's more things like you know jealousy and blood and violence and passion. Those are the three things that kind of get touched on, and the color theory of the film kind of goes with that because those are the colors. Those are the colors that it brings out. So I was very 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 impressed with that. I think it was a really really good move from the colorist and probably DOP as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like some of the scenes where color is used, and I think like anytime it is used, it grabs your attention, but also it emphasizes certain things. Like to give you an example, so there's that sequence in the car where Dwight is driving. It's that really weird, again, kind of darkly comic, like just bizarre scene where Jackie Boy, the guy who's just been killed, like despite being clearly dead, he's just like talking as if he's alive.
Yeah,
And in it, you see the reflection of like I think it's like green or like yeah, it's like the reflection of various colors, and I think it just adds to the surreal atmosphere. And it does make you wonder, like, is Dwight just imagining him, or is Jackie Boy somehow still alive?
and given what characters can survive in this film, you kind of do sit there and you're like, I would buy it if he wasn't, you know, if he wasn't dead. Like it's because I think that's something brilliant about the film. Actually, it really does immerse you into its world, and it
Mhm.
does make the world a very unstable and both easy and difficult to understand at the same time. I think that's really something about it as well.
The amount of like trauma that certain characters go through, you do kind of wonder like how they can survive it. But the world is heightened enough where you can kind of buy it. So the way that Marv's story concludes, it concludes with him getting the electric chair, and they have to do it twice. But because of the way that Marv is being characterized, like what you've seen about him, you could conceivably buy that they'd have to do like two jolts of electricity to like finish him off. The other thing that I think kind of grounds this film as well, despite how like absurd and cartoonish it is that like each of the stories do have this very like strong undercurrent of men and women as well fighting against corruption. If there are any like central antagonists in this film, it's the Rourke family
Yeah,
because they kind of factor into almost every story. Or they factor into the first story featuring Marv, and they factor into the beginning and ending story, that yellow bastard, featuring Hartigan, because like in many respects they're the ones responsible for it, but for these bad things that happen.
Mm.
But even in the middle story, you have Jackie Boy, who's this rated cop, but he's also like an abusive shithead, and a general scumbag. And or even you have like Manute, who's supposed to be like the enforcer for this like unseen mobster. So despite like the absurdity of the film, there is this genuine sense of like, as you said, hopelessness, but also this kind of sense of like get revenge on a corrupt system.
Yeah, I think what's really quite fascinating about the film is, the message it does send about that ability to fight the system. Because on some levels, all the protagonists on some level win. You've got Marv, who he gets killed with an electric chair throughout the film, but he kills Kevin, he kills the cardinal of the Rourke family, who kind of
Yeah.
set everything up in the first place. He stops a cannibal, and yeah, sure, like the system doesn't turn around and blame him for it, and it obviously does perpetuate itself because the cardinal's son is still the senator. But
Hmm.
Marv gets to do what he wants. He gets to avenge Goldie's death,
Yeah.
and he gets to go out violently, which is kind of the best ending that his character was ever going to have. He's almost a dead man walking throughout the film anyway, and he
Hmm.
knows it because he's kind of lost his taste for violence, but at the same time, it's the only thing that keeps him going. Like he tries to convince himself that he's lost his taste for it, but
Hmm.
he doesn't ever in the
He
film.
tries to convince himself that he's crazy too. But to be honest, he actually is a lot more sane than many of the other characters, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think a lot of the characters are trying to hold on to some image of themselves that their actions really do show to be wrong. And I find that a really, really interesting character dynamic. And I think it's one of the few instances where I like quite a lot of narration in a film, because usually it can be a bit hit or miss.
It's like the internal monologue, so therefore it's not like we're seeing like a character kind of explain stuff or telling the story. It's more like we're seeing their internal thoughts and their comments on a situation.
It's almost like the perfect cinematic representation of reading a comic book, not with the little text, but bubbles and all of that. It still kind of keeps itself cinema, but sure, it perfectly captures the feeling of reading a Frank Miller comic book.
Yeah.
That's something that I really, really enjoyed about the film, because it was Frank Miller at its peak. And I think Robert Rodriguez did a really, really good job at helping. I mean, I know Frank Miller was there to help him direct it as well, but I think
Mhm.
Rodriguez, he definitely brought the action to be very, very exciting, and he was able to capture all of the very comic booky violence, like the 2 feet through the car door when Marv jumped through that windshield,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
or I think it had that same sense of energy and momentum that you get from things like Mariachi and Desperado.
Yeah.
But it still kept the very slower paced, more noir sensibilities, and I think those two visuals together, those styles really complemented each other in a way that I really didn't expect them to.
Despite obviously it being very Miller focused, I do think this film could also be called like the best Tarantino film that he never made, because so Tarantino did have a part in this film. He directed the scene where Jackie Boy's like speaking despite being dead. But aside from that, he didn't have anything else to do with it. But weirdly, this film does feel kind of like Rodriguez's like Pulp Fiction, essentially. Like
Yeah,
it feels very like obviously you have a similar like kind of structure to Pulp Fiction in that you have like these individual stories that kind of link up to each other. In tone, it kind of feels like the perfect marriage between the sort of action blockbuster sensibilities of Rodriguez, but also the kind of ultra violent, witty, dark humor of Tarantino as well.
I think it is a very, very good blend of both of those things. I think it's just got some very, very impactful moments with
Yeah.
Haskell's death at the end, for instance.
Yeah.
I think that is the epitome of bleak hopefulness, because
Yeah, it is.
on the one hand, he saved Nancy. On the other hand, he
Mhm.
fucking shot himself in the mouth. He's dead. Bittersweet's not even the word. It is just bleak hope. That's what it is, because he's kind of there like, okay, I can't get out of this, but
Mhm.
she might. And
Yeah. Hmm.
and then when it goes to that completely whited out silhouette of Hartigan, and the bullet goes through, I think that was just almost because it takes you out of it. It's almost more emotional in a way, because it kind of brings you to that moment. And I just thought that was really evocative, because it takes away the identity, and it kind of makes you sit there and you can go, oh, that's just how this world works. And I think
Yeah.
that feeling is just, it's part of what then sells the rest of the film still to you right at the end as well. And then, well,
Mhm.
not quite right at the end. I mean, there are the Hitman bookends. The end of that story, it kind of which keeps it feeling more believable.
The Marv story and the Hartigan stories, you could argue, are kind of like tragedies,
Yeah,
because both of them are about like people who are on like borrowed time, but even despite that, they're still like doing the best that they can to defeat the bad guy and do something for somebody, for like the woman that they love, whether that be like somebody that they barely knew, or maybe or like a little kid who then grew up to be an adult. But that's kind of what makes it like satisfying as well. Because the thing about this film is that I think it could have very easily been, a machismo like action flick about like tough guys just like killing people, torturing people, and whatever. But one of the things that prevents that is that you have flawed tough guys going up against pure evil. All of the antagonists in Sin City are completely incapable of like redemption or even showing any sign of goodness. Like they're all pure evil. Like Rourke is Senator Rourke is pure evil. Cardinal Rourke is pure evil. Kevin is pure evil. Rourke Jr. is pure evil. Even Manu is pure evil, and obviously you have Jackie Boy as well. So that kind of makes it a bit more like palatable. It kind of makes you okay with watching these not necessarily heroic people fighting against these other people. But also I think that the film, it does have that undercurrent of heart as well. Like despite being dark, there is a decent amount of heart, whether it be like Hartigan. Like his storylines are easily the most emotional, and that's partially just because he goes through so much awful shit. But it's also because there is that strong heart of the fact that I mean, out of all the protagonists, he's the most heroic.
yeah,
In
he
fact,
is.
I'd call him probably the most saintly as well, because like to me, the Hartigan character, he's almost like Sin City's version of Jesus Christ. He suffers so much for other people, and how he even gets betrayed by one of his followers. Bob at the beginning, his partner betrays him. So that's another Christ parallel. But so there's that like kind of heart to it, and there's also the heart in Dwight's story as well. Because Dwight does genuinely give a shit about people. Like he cares about Shelley, still likes Gale. So as a result, because you have these genuine things of like compassion, I think that kind of offsets it from being too unpleasant.
I think it's got those very, very human moments in it that really do stop it from being miserable, and it kind of gives it it's almost a world you definitely wouldn't want to be a part of. It's a world that you kind of think could get better, even though it probably won't. A big part that keeps us invested in the stories, because it doesn't
Mhm.
quite extinguish any sense that the world could be a good place. It's very, very bad. And I think that works wonders for just from an investment standpoint. I really wanted to touch on one aspect of the film that I found a bit more troubling as I was watching. I found, some of the relationships and the gender politics were quite uncomfortable in the film.
I was wondering how we were going to like move into that. So, I mean, obviously, you could say that this isn't helped by like Miller's like other works as well and perception of that. So let's not bring up stuff like All Star Batman and Robin and other stuff like that, and just focus on this film. Like watching the film, like yeah, there is some stuff that I agree hasn't aged that well. For the most part, I don't think it's like too offensive or anything like that. There's only really one aspect to the film, that like one consistent theme that I did think was a bit of a problem. And that's that like throughout the film, obviously every single storyline, I would say this strong theme of men saving women, of men being the saviors of women, of men being the only ones capable of saving women, and of women not necessarily being able to save themselves. I've
Yeah,
noticed.
yeah, because I found it really odd because you had the whole thing with the old town and the prostitutes that kind of controlled that area and seemed like they should be able to protect themselves. They still needed Dwight to come in and save the day and stop it, even though the women should have been on paper from what they could do with their actions far more capable, and
Yeah.
that was quite a thing. Although that bothered me less than the relationship between Hartigan and Nancy. I found that deeply, deeply uncomfortable. I think that's where the flawed side of Askin came in, because obviously it's this. He saved her when she was 11 years old, and then he becomes 19, and then he should have known that was somewhere that he shouldn't go, like emotionally, and it's and and it becomes understandable in a way. It's the only company that he has for 8 years, but while he's in prison, her letter's the only thing that he's got. But at the same time, he makes the point that he's old enough to be a grandfather and things like that, and that's
Yeah.
I think the bigger problem is that it's very, very clearly a case of hero worship, and there's no genuine love to that. And he doesn't quite let himself just succumb to it, but he does in a way that he shouldn't at times.
I do kind of agree. Like, what I think they were going for. So he does love her, obviously, but at first it is like a father loves a daughter. Although he doesn't like that she's become like a stripper. As a result of that, he's starting to confuse love with lust and fatherly love with romantic love. You could say that that's an internal conflict, best exemplified in the bit where they're in that, like, I think, like motel room or whatever, where on the one hand he's like warding off her advances because she's fallen out in love with him, but it's like he's obviously in conflict, like he doesn't want to, and then they start like making out and stuff, and then he like pushes himself away. But I think that scene is although it's a bit awkward, I agree, it is slightly remedied by him at the end just saying I love you too. I feel like that's a very sincere moment, and I think to some degree that's him saying that even if he doesn't love her romantically, he still does love her. But I agree, it is quite awkward.
I think it actually adds to the world, because it is such an uncomfortable relationship. I think my problem with the way it's presented like it's okay almost, and I think if it was a little more clearly presented as something that's wrong, or at the very least, a bit more complicated than it was, I think that would have really, really helped.
If it had gone into kind of Nancy's like psyche or whatever, like, or it kind of pointed out that maybe even Nancy had some kind of internal conflict or whatever, if it had done stuff like that, then you could have thought to yourself like, okay, well, it's not as simple as just like she's in love with him. It's like, it's like she owes a debt to him, but she's also kind of, given how he's probably the only person who's ever been nice to her, she probably would have feelings of love. And it's like so there is stuff that could have been dived into, but for the most part you just see it from Hartigan's perspective. What I would say I more had an issue with was I think was Marv's storyline. And the main reason why is because so in the Marv story, he's had this one night stand with Goldie, this prostitute, and then after she's been killed, like he's going on this like semi clear my name, but mainly just get revenge plotline. And then you have Goldie's sister Wendy who comes in, and she also wants revenge too. The thing I have about this storyline is that although obviously the Marv character is a really interesting character, I personally feel like he's kind of taking away from what would be a more emotionally resonant, more kind of I'd use this word, but like female empowering story that would have just been focused on Wendy. She's the one with like this sisterly relationship. She hasn't been framed for murder, but she's in like an even less like capable position than Marv. I do wonder if that storyline would have been better if it wasn't focused on Marv.
I don't know, because I think the story really, really worked. I do think that Wendy should have been more involved with it for sure, and I would actually have loved to see. It's hard because I love Marv as a character. I want him to have a story, but I think you're right. I think that story is perhaps maybe not the one that he should have had if Wendy was involved. I think part of that's the time it was written, which isn't an excuse for it at all. But obviously, when the story was written, there was a lot less of a female protagonist in that kind of story, especially with very male-driven comic book writing at the time.
And how often do you see like noir films that are focused on, that are focused on female protagonists? Oftentimes it's the male protagonist.
I think if the film was to be revisited or re-examined, I think Wendy should have been the focus of that story and should have been more involved. And I think she should have been able to, kill Kevin. I think
it is mitigated despite the fact that they barely knew each other. You can understand why Marv would have fallen in love with Goldie.
Yeah, I mean, the story as it is works very, very well. You know, and I do enjoy it. I just kind of, again, do also see your point
Hmm.
about that. I don't know. It might have worked better if it was more of a partnership kind of deal. It's been quite an interesting thing to deal with, or you know, following Wendy, and she kind of hears about Marv doing these things. We do see Marv do these things as well, but we kind of get it more from Wendy's perspective. I think it was, you know, I think it would be something that would be interesting, but obviously
Yeah.
it's not the way that film works because it's less a criticism and more a, oh, that would have been neat.
And one thing I did as well when I was watching the film was I was taking note of how long each storyline was, like how many minutes, I mean. And the Marv story was like about 30 minutes, and the Dwight story was like 40 minutes. So I do wonder if they could have, if it like, I mean, if they were going to make Marv's story any longer, that's probably what they could have done to expand it and maybe make it deeper. But at the same time, I mean, it might have caused the film to like drag. You know, I mean, so the film is like 2 hours long. On my first viewing, I did find it a bit too long, but on my second viewing, I thought it flowed quite well.
I think it flows really well as a film. You know, it works. There's a couple of places where you know it drags a little bit more as you kind of get the creeping creeping sense. But then for me, that kind of builds a sense of dread and anticipation that kind of runs the film.
Yeah, I would say the only part of the film that could maybe have been cut or condensed or something is probably just the Dwight storyline. It goes from Dwight taking out Jackie Boy or Dwight getting Miho to take out Jackie Boy. So all of a sudden, like, oh shit, Jackie Boy's a cop. This could like throw the truce between the cops and Old Town into like, you know, disarray or whatever. So obviously you can understand it getting a bit more complex, but then all of a sudden, you know, you have the process of trying to like dispose of the body, and then the body of Jackie Boy, and then some Irish mercenaries get control of the body, and all of that stuff in between. I think could have maybe been a bit condensed.
Sure, you know, I think there were elements of it that were just kind of, oh, okay. And while I was, you know, I was enjoying them, but at the same time, from a pure narrative perspective, they weren't necessary. For example, why didn't he just get the head? If he got the head in the sewers and got in the sewer and gotten there, it wouldn't have changed anything about the story. Yeah, it would have robbed us of one car chase, but it wasn't a particularly interesting car chase. I mean, it works, but it wasn't
Mhm.
like, you know, it wasn't like
Yeah,
some chases earlier in the film. It was kind of just, oh, there are still some mercenaries. Okay,
I would probably say that that bit was the most like filler-ish section of the film, but that's just because it was more of a connective tissue as a way to like get the Jackie Boy head to the point to where it could be put in that transfer situation, you know, that
yeah,
climaxes that story. Um, and that story does have the most abrupt ending of
that's
all of them as well.
yeah, it does. And I think, Joel, that's why I think I wanted him to have gotten the head in the sewer because it's where he meets the explosive expert,
Hmm.
it's where he probably got the explosives to begin with anyway.
Hmm.
And if he got in their head at the same time, it would have just you didn't need the car chase.
I do also think that like although the Dwight story does end a bit abruptly, I feel like all of the stories in general have very like satisfying beginning, middle, and ends. I especially like the choice to split up the Hardican story because that is also kind of a book ending as well. It's like the main story that you begin with and the main story that you end with, and there's like a passage of time that progresses as well.
Yeah, and it kind of gives you the passage of time in the story as well because it's, you know, it
Yeah.
lets you feel the 8 years a bit, and it also gives it a nice sense of poetic when it's you know with where you get to repeat that a young girl lives, an old man dies, fair
Fair
trade.
trade, yeah.
Which is good. Although I must admit, from a purely logical storytelling perspective, it might have been better to have a couple of the scenes that were in the second segment, in the first segment, like when he's in the hospital and things like that, and then start with his time in prison. That might have worked a bit better, but then I
I
I don't
disagree.
think that. Okay,
Because and the only reason why I'm saying that is just because it makes it a bit of a surprise. Because the way that the first story ends, you think that Hardigan dies, and I think it's good to like hold off on going back to that story for a while. So therefore, you then it's then more of a surprise and a shock when he turns out to still be alive. And also another good thing as well is that like you know it kind of helps for the because even though each of the stories are self-contained, the film does still have to try and follow like the three-act structure.
yeah,
So therefore, and as part of that, it's like you have Nancy, who is in a couple of scenes, and then she comes into play into the climax as well. So it's kind of good, like I guess you could say Chekhov's gun or like foreshadowing. And also it's kind of good as well. It's like, you have the antagonist in the first half, and then you have that same antagonist come back in a different form, Rourke Jr. At the end as well. Like I do kind of like how just unapologetically sleazy this film is as well. Like it pulls no punches in regards to like, depicting a cannibalist, a corrupt like domestic abuser, a corrupt senator. What else? Like, oh yeah, and the ultimate thing, Rourke Jr., the serial killer pedophile. I do wonder if Sin City at the time was a bit game changing, because I can't think of any other like such hot like hardcore comic book films that really focused on that kind of evil.
No, not really, because you had the ones that followed, characters with dark pasts, like A History of Violence, that were really, really violent and things like that. And you had a couple grittier ones at the time. I think Sin City is just a very, very unique beast. I think there are things that are somewhat comparable, and I think the only ones that are somewhat comparable are also based at least partially on Frank Miller's work. I think the closest thing, superhero wise, that kind of deals with that for me, that kind of world, that incredibly bleak as well, where things just go wrong, is probably Netflix's Daredevil. Like almost the nearest that you get in terms of having that kind of hard edged character with a bit of the Catholic moments, except not quite so violent as Marv's. You have those moments interspersed with moments of extreme violence. I think it is the closest you get. But even then, it's not Sin City. I think Sin City its ultra violence really sets it apart from other films, because it's very, very stylized and impossible to achieve human wise, which kind of puts you on another level with humans. But in the film, but it also gives you this sense of this overwhelmingly bleak and horrible sense that kind of sells the overwhelmingly bleak and horrible world.
And what kind of also makes it a bit more palatable as well was like the dialogue as well, because we know that like Frank Miller's dialogue would really go off the rails, but this did kind of prove that he did have a bit of a mastery of it. Because this is a very, very quotable film, to the point where like how stuff like the Star Wars prequels or like original Spider-Man films, how like those movies have just been like memed to death. I'm kind of surprised that Sin City hasn't gone through a similar phrase of like memeing, because there's a lot of like lines that you could turn into memes, or a lot of lines that you could just quote. Like to give it like, especially all of like Marv's lines, like like him saying like, "It's a damn fine coat you're wearing. I love hitmen. No matter what you do to them, you don't feel bad." Or like the heaven, the hell I'm gonna send him to will feel like heaven after what I've done to him. All of these like quotes, or even like stuff that Dwight says like, "Hi, I'm Shelley's new boyfriend, and I'm out of my mind." There's a lot of like really good lines that really like stick with you and really just like and just get a reaction out of you.
Yeah, it's quite. They are. They're quite evocative. And they sell all these characters as troubled, violent lunatics, which is kind of what all of them ultimately are to a degree. I mean, Hartigan has an obsessive heroes complex that just doesn't let him die, even when he perhaps really should. He can't give up, and that's he's got that obsessive level of insanity. Marv's grip on reality is tenuous at best, and Clyde is just this kind of violent monster who's almost trying to direct that in a good way.
I actually think that Dwight, you could argue, is a bit more of a like kind of like Hartigan. Dwight is a bit more of a traditional hero.
I don't see that at all. Actually, I see that unlike Hartigan, a lot of his violence is protective, but I think unlike Hartigan, he enjoys it in a way that you shouldn't as a hero, and I think. Yeah,
I can see that.
I think part of the reason he does act is less to be protective, and more because these kind of people just annoy him, and it gives him an excuse, as opposed to being actually driven to protect. I think he likes the excuse.
On the one hand, I do kind of disagree, and that's just because, I do think that Dwight, he's kind of like the guy who is trying to solve problems all throughout the film. The entire storyline is like, oh shit, we can't let this turn into like an all-out war, or so all-out like gang war. So it's like his attempts at preventing it. But at the same time, in his character, I can kind of see what you're talking about. He seems fairly like desensitized to violence. You know, he doesn't like he doesn't really care. You know, unlike Marv or unlike Hartigan, he doesn't seem to care about the violence that surrounds him. You know, he just seems again desensitized. There's that bit in the Marv story where he walks into the bar and you see Dwight, and you see him give a bit of an internal monologue, and he says like, no, I don't see Marv as a brute. I just see him as being born in the wrong century. If he was in Roman times, he'd fit right in, or something like that. And he's kind of justifying, you know, Marv's like brutish ways, you know, like he's saying like, and he's saying, I don't see anything insane about this guy. So I can see what you mean in that regard.
Yeah, well, I do definitely see your point about him being a traditional hero. I just hesitate, especially with Sin City and Frank Miller's writing in general. I always hesitate to use the word hero because just
Anti-hero is a better term.
yeah, I think, or even just bad people who happen to be doing good. I don't even think terms like hero and villain apply to Frank Miller characters quite a lot. I mean, obviously you get the. I mean, some of them are pure evil. I think villain applies a lot more readily than hero does. But I do find Frank Miller's characters just these insurmountable forces of will, and
Mm-hmm.
I think the black and white really helps sell that because it gives them this very absolutist thinking that runs the film, and I
Mm-hmm.
think the long shots of just them taking damage and just stepping forward, and the way that the
Mm-hmm.
camera lingers on them while this
Yeah.
happens, I just think it really sells that insurmountable will aspect, and I think in a way it's this darkly inspirational thing that you might get fucked up and you might die, but you can win while you're doing it. I think
Yeah.
I find that quite an interesting thing about the film, and I think it's one of the reasons that I really love it.
I think maybe the strongest aspect of this film, and this is something that I don't often like praising in films because I think it's like it's not I don't always think it's that noteworthy. But I have to say the cast and casting in this film is spot on.
Yeah,
Like it's
casting
the
is really
casting is spot on, but the acting all around is easily, I think it's maybe the reason why this film works. It's one of the reasons why this film works, I think.
it's such a pulpy film that if you didn't cast it right, then the lines would not feel believable. It wouldn't sell you. But I think the way that people they embody their characters and convict them, you kind of get this massive range from everyone of different things. And for some people, it's quite subtle, like Bruce Willis. I think Bruce Willis is very much a subtle actor.
In this film, it was so good being reminded of how good of an actor he can be,
Yeah.
because like you know in like all the time he just perfectly sells that like torment but still that will to survive and help somebody, and you know he's got the perfect voice for the role. He looks perfect. It was a bit funny when he was referred to as being like 60 because he really did not look 60 at all. He looked like he was like 50, maybe. But he didn't quite look like an old man.
To be fair, 60 is not that old. Like it is, but it's
No.
also not like I don't know. I find the area around 40 to 70 can be really ambiguous. What I thought was really important is you just got these characters that were once vulnerable and impassive, and the people they cast for it as well have these very quiet emotions, very quiet kind of characters in there. You don't get this wildness from any of them, but you get such a range. Like Clive Owen, for example, this is probably my favourite performance from him outside of Children of Men.
I have grown to like him as Dwight because when I first saw the film, I'll be honest, I actually thought that he was the weak link. But as I think about it more, I do think I was probably misjudging him, and I do think that I do think that he does do quite a good job. But compared to Bruce Willis or even especially Mickey Rourke as the Marv character, I do think that he doesn't quite fit as well. But I do think that his acting is good. You know, I do think that it could just be like the accent that he's putting on. I think because compared to like Willis or Rourke, who just naturally sound like these characters, you can tell that Owen is kind of putting on an accent. But despite that, he's still very appropriate for the role of Dwight.
I think the problem with the Dwight story in general is that it goes on a bit too long and isn't as connected to everything else. So it
Mm-hmm.
always feels like I think that holds that part back quite a bit because with Marv you can see how it feeds into the overall Hartigan story because it gives
Mm-hmm.
you the information of Rourke, we know that name.
Mm-hmm.
Rourke Jr. was okay. and then the Cardinals made his son the senator, who's made his son. Oh, okay, and that kind of clicks.
Yeah.
So that when you get to the Hartman story, it gives you the context. But the Clyde one kind of gives you the idea of there's being mobs and influence, but it doesn't do much else. It helps build the world out a bit, but it doesn't service the main plot as well. And I think, while I really like the sequence, I feel like you could lose most of that story and it wouldn't matter.
Maybe. Yeah, to bring it back to Clive Owen, do you think that Clive Owen like carries that entire storyline and makes it more effective than it could have been?
I would put it just on his shoulders. Rosario Dawson's great as always. Michael Clarke Duncan gives this very, very imposing performance that really works.
Yeah.
I didn't like Becky. I didn't think that worked. I didn't believe her betraying them particularly because
okay.
So that also was a problem with me with Clive's story. Some of the characters weren't really properly set up for me, and I just didn't care about them as much.
Okay.
I think Clive Owen and Rosario Dawson and Michael Clarke Duncan really helped bring it up.
I have to say that this is like, if you want a perfect microcosm of what actors were popular in the 2000s, then I think that this is one of the best examples of that. If you saw this film when it came out, you would have been like, oh yeah, that guy, I know him from this film. Or you would have said like, oh, that guy who has appeared in a bunch of films, he's now appearing in this one. Like, obviously you have some more like long-term people like Bruce Willis or even like Mickey Rourke to an extent. But also you have other people in there too. Like you have Josh Hartnett as the hitman. You have Nick Stahl as Rourke Jr., who was previously in Terminator 3 as John Connor. You've got Michael Madsen. I mean, he's a bit more long term, but yeah.
I thought that was actually quite a good performance. I really liked that. I mean, I know it's quite a small one, but it really saw me because you get the sense that he does care about Hartigan, but he also likes the money more. You kind of get that real, and like he just feels corrupt. Everything he says and everything he does. I mean, because he is, but
yeah,
you kind of really do get that impression from the character, and you get that, and he builds a relationship really well with Bruce Willis, where you kind of with Bruce Willis's character, where you kind of get just old history between them, and this modicum of tension that doesn't actually matter too much between them. Like there is tension, but it's not like either one of them gives a shit. And I think that's just a very, very interesting dynamic. I think it's because the actors play off each other so well.
There's a great line where he says, "Hell of a way to end a partnership after like knocking Bob out." But yeah, I mean, if I did have one problem, it's that like in the first scene between them, I did think that the dialogue that Bob was saying felt a bit, and this could maybe be delivery, or I think it was the writing. The dialogue that Bob was saying was very unnatural. The dialogue that Hartigan was saying worked, but the dialogue that Bob was saying was a bit weird.
Well, I disagree with you. I don't think any of the dialogue in that first section worked. I was like, when it was that first conversation between him and Bob, I did not like it. I thought it felt very exposition heavy. It didn't make sense.
Yeah, from Bob's perspective, I agree. I can't remember anything about Hartigan's.
Well, I think when he went, he said. He was like, Nancy Callahan, 11-year-old girl. It was a bit like, cool, thanks for just giving us the description. You wouldn't, to me, it didn't feel right. You wouldn't have done it. Like, if he literally just said, look, there's a little girl, something like, there's a little girl in there. Like, there's a little girl in there. I'm going. That would have felt more natural than, Nancy Callahan, 11 years old, blah, blah, blah.
Did he actually say that to Bob? Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I thought he was that was just in his monologue, but no, he said it out loud. Yeah. No, I agree with what you're saying. Again, I think it's more. But I saw it more from Bob's angle. That his words were kind of very strange and awkward. Oh, and probably the most bizarre but quite effective one. Elijah Wood as Kevin. At the time, I don't think anybody would expect him to play like a mute cannibal, but he is quite creepy looking.
He gives that Marv story just this extra level of just creep and almost like this just unsettling moment. I think it plays well against Mickey Rourke's quite stoic and aggressive performance. And it's like almost this calm, almost this, he's got this almost calm way that he does it, but it's this calm aggression that he kind of has, and I think it plays off really well because he's the only character that doesn't react.
I like the character contrast in the Marv story, because in the Marv story, Kevin is kind of the villain. I like the contrast between him and Marv. He's a young, agile, mute, pure evil, cannibal and serial killer as well. Whereas you have Marv, this like old, brutish, grizzly, like is outwardly violent but has a heart. You have that contrast between the two, and you also have a similar contrast between like Hardigan and Rourke Jr. You have the grizzled old, man with a heart of gold, whereas you have, the young, evil, totally like in the Rourke case, you have like an old man who goes through so much shit versus like a young, spoiled guy who, at the end of the first story, gets his like nuts blown off. He gets like brutalized, but he still comes back, just with a yellow appearance, So I think that character writing is good. And the final thing I just want to point out about the cast as well is that like watching it, it does feel a bit like sad as well because the actors that are in it are dead. Like at least four of them. Like that, like Michael Clark Duncan, Rutger Hauer, Powers Booth, and especially in a turn that I thought was like really good, Brittany Murphy as Shelley. I thought that she did a really, really excellent job for for a role that's like not that big. I thought that she did a really great job. I think she even outacted Benicio del Toro as well.
Yeah.
So that was just a talent gone way too soon. So I do think that that aspect, it does kind of make the film a bit more like of a sad watch. Like seeing these like famous actors who are all dead, but but it is kind of, but it's still good to obviously watch them like giving really like good performances.
So yeah, I think that wraps us up on Sin City. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Like despite some flaws, I do think it's a really good film. I do think it's quite. I would say it's essential viewing for anybody who's like a comic book fan or anybody who just wants to see the kind of interesting, unique things that can be done with a comic book adaptation.
If you're a big fan of neo noir, if you're a fan of Frank Miller in general, it's very very visually arresting. I think that's something that really should be taken into account when you're going to view it because I think it's one of the most unique visual films that you'll see.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's
Yeah.
worth it for that alone. The performances are phenomenal, and it's just a really fantastic display of the kind of stories that can be, told within a noir world, and it's one of the better world buildings that I've seen. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would say it was very very worth it.
We discussed Sin City in the previous episode. Now we'll be discussing the sequel, Sin City: A Dame to Kill For. I'll describe the plot this time. Follows. It's kind of a prequel sequel. So the main storyline, the A Dame to Kill For story, is a prequel about Dwight set before the events of the first film. That's like the big storyline. But there's also a story focusing on Joseph Gordon-Levitt as this like cocky gambler who ends up like basically beating the wrong man. And then finally, you have a sequel to the Hartigan story in the first film, which focuses on Nancy, who has now become like all traumatized by Hartigan's suicide. And there's a prologue featuring Marv.
It kind of tries to imitate the structure of the first film. Got it quite a lot, although I don't feel like it's quite as smooth this time around.
There's a lot of things that kind of pale in comparison.
Whenever I was watching it, for me, the Dwight story dragged on quite a lot. And it was also, I think, it's the same problem as the last one, the least interesting of the stories. It had good elements. Eva Green as Ava was quite manipulative, and that was fun to watch. Josh Brolin, as usual, gives a good performance, but I think the actual narrative was just, I don't know, it just didn't really work as much for me because I feel like Dwight was a much dumber character in this film than he was in the last one. It doesn't quite fly for me.
So I agree with that. I agree with the fact. I agree with the fact that it also kind of feels a bit too long. But the reason why I feel like that is compared to the first film, because although in the first film the Dwight storyline was longer than the other ones, the Marv story and the kind of Hartigan story, the length of both of those stories did help to kind of offset it because they were like around the same length. I mean, the Hartigan story was kind of split up in two. But but in this film though, there's not. It kind of feels like that's the only story that has any kind of like substance because the gambler story, the Long Bad Night, that one is also split up into two. But I don't think it's a very long story. And I think the same goes for the Nancy story, which I think is only like 25 minutes or something.
Because I think the Gambler story is probably around half an hour to 35 minutes at most. But the problem I find with the way that they use that, because I try and imitate what they did with Hartigan, which is where they split it up in two. And other
Hmm.
than the fact that Hartigan's story was the last proper story in the original Sin City, so it made sense to cut back to it at that point and gave us the closure of what we started the film with, which was bookending and nice, which is not the case for this film. Another thing that was an advantage for the Hartigan story is that we technically already had our closure on it the first time around. So when we revisited it, it felt more like an interesting surprise as opposed to, oh, we've got to get back to that. That
Hmm.
investment got sacrificed because they cut it off halfway through. And
Hmm.
it didn't work almost like a self-contained short film, like the first film's first Hartigan segment did. But it was kind of just left us hanging a bit, and I think that really hurt the film because I still wanted to know about the Gambler stuff because I thought Joseph Gordon-Levitt gave a good performance and I was vaguely interested in that storyline. The way that I just wasn't interested in Dwight's as much because the film hadn't set up that investment for me yet and it hadn't given enough closure on the last bit for me to care about the new bit.
To bring it onto the film overall bit, so this isn't like a terrible movie by any means. It is very, very like painfully average. And the thing that I can say about any film or comic book or whatever that like Frank Miller has had his like name attached to is that normally like they're either really, really good or really, really awful. Like if you read a Frank Miller book or if you like watch a Frank Miller film, then like you're probably either gonna love it or you're gonna really, really hate it. But the thing about this film is that I feel like it's kind of hard to love or hate because it isn't as like misguided or terrible or anything like that as like The Spirit, which was the previous comic book film that he directed, which was truly awful. It's not as bad as that, but at the same time, it's not as good as the first Sin City. Blame can also be to Rodriguez as well, because this one just doesn't have the same creative spark or like impact or anything. Like, there's not a moment that kind of rivals anything in the first film. To me, what it kind of feels like is just another Sin City film. It has that energy of like what happens when you watch like a TV show that's maybe been going on too long, where like all of the same elements that you like are there, but the inspiration and the great quality that was there in like previously is kind of not there anymore. But the difference is that this is like movie number two.
There was stuff that I maybe wanted to revisit but wasn't revisited, and then there's some stuff that I just didn't, it wasn't enough to care about. And I think becoming an issue as the film went. I think, obviously going into it, the most interesting story that really should have been picked up from the first one is the Nancy story because I was engaged for that, but it felt just really quick and not in a oh wow that's driven and purpose driven. It felt more like oh we've got to include this story and we didn't leave ourselves enough time in the script and the studio wanted it to be this long.
And also it kind of justifies it being a sequel as well, because I mean the Nancy stuff does kind of come in the Long Bad Night, the gambler story. It kind of interrupts that story. But for the most part, this could have just been a full-on prequel. But I get that they wanted to like still make it a sequel, so they did include that story. I do agree that could have been that storyline could have been longer. But I also do feel, maybe with the exception of the A Dame to Kill For story, I don't really think that any of the stories necessarily justify their own existence. And as much as they try to, I don't quite feel like they necessarily justify being told. Again, they do sort of feel more like what you would get in like, the later season of like a TV show or like the later film in like in like a movie series or something where you think to yourself like, okay, all right, well, this is kind of fun to see, but is it really like necessary for us to have this story be told? Like, to give you an example, the Long Bad Night, the gambler story, it's like they try and give it this sense of importance and tie it into the larger Sin City kind of storyline, but I don't really think that it was necessary. I feel like it could have just stood kind of on its own.
I don't mind the idea of it showing Rawkoff to be this not great person, even though we already know that.
Hmm.
Probably the most believable story. Like could see that story going down a lot more than probably some of the others,
Yeah,
realistically. But
yeah, absolutely.
it's got that going for it.
Hmm.
but I think in the end, it's the one story that's got no connection to the original film, particularly,
Hmm.
and I think it's also one that doesn't particularly, it feels the most unnecessary.
I do think that if it had been just completely unconnected, then you could have still said that, but you could have also been like, well, I mean, it kind of just expands the world, and it's just another story that's being told in this world. But what they tried to do story wise, like to me, it just felt a bit like miscalculated because like what they attempt to do is they attempt to kind of do this weird kind of narrative where it turns out that this Johnny guy is Senator Rourke's like illegitimate son, and I think that that they were trying to do some kind of comparison thing between him, like this illegitimate son, and Rourke Jr., who was Senator Rourke's legitimate son. Like I think that they're trying to do it and trying to like make it another story about Rourke wanting to keep his legacy and reputation. But honestly, I feel like the Nancy storyline kind of covers that well enough anyway. All it really does, it shows that like Rourke is totally obsessed with like his image and again his legacy. But even then, I think like the fact that Rourke gets killed in the end, I feel kind of undermines that because like who cares if I don't know, he got beaten at poker twice, he's been killed, so he's not going to be able to live with the shame of that, you know.
Yeah, he's just not going to have to deal with it. So it almost feels a bit superfluous to be there because it doesn't need to be. I would definitely agree with that. I think it's almost is a story that didn't need to be told, and I think it's carried well by the actors. I think they do a really good job. I think it comes through quite nicely, most of it as well. But I ultimately kind of think, is it necessarily the film that needed to be made? And I think the honest answer to that is probably no.
And what's kind of hard to escape as well is that this sort of one like is that this film at the time in development how I even like as a kid I even remember hearing about this movie like before it actually got made. I remember like hearing that they were gonna adapt it, that they were going to adapt the A Dame to Kill For storyline, into another film. So it did take a while to get off the ground, but then eventually they were able to do it. So I think that that does give you like a bit more of an expectation that they'll like kind of like, have very very good reasons to make another one, and that wouldn't necessarily exist if they had just made this immediately after the first film. Like the film that feeling of like not a sequel that took a decade to make, but a sequel that took like a year to make. But at the same time, though, I mean, it's not again like because it does have elements from the first film, like things that still work. It doesn't feel like a complete and total cash grab because I do think that there are some elements to it that are kind of inspired. Like again, the gambler storyline. I actually was quite engaged in that, and I did think that like the themes of that story did almost make it worthwhile. It's just again undermined by the final story. I do like the premise of the Nancy story. I do like the idea of like how because it does give Nancy more of a character than just like a damsel in distress.
Yeah, and I quite like that she had the narration as well on the drive, and was almost playing the manipulative game. To be fair, she almost reminded me of a more morally decent Ava when she was going. The way that she was able to use different situations to manipulate them to her advantage, but with a better goal. And I quite
Oh,
enjoyed
okay.
that dynamic. But I almost wish it had either been explored more, or the gambler
Mm,
story somehow tied into it, so that then
mhm.
the gambler story felt a bit more relevant. I think that's my major problem with the film and the way it's kind of set up. The gambler story is never shown to have that much of an effect on Raw. It doesn't matter.
Those two storylines could have, like, since they share an antagonist, I think could have been melded together. But really, the only time they get brought together is just in that bit where you see Nancy considering shooting him. During the bit where he's at his poker table, you see Nancy. She has a gun. She's considering firing it, shooting him. So they come in that bit, but other than that, they don't really link. And yeah, it is true. Like that story could have been one story. In fact.
If it had been put into tying it together, it might have actually been quite an interesting dynamic story. One thing I did appreciate about this version of the film, even though I think it was somewhat clumsily done, was it did give the female characters more and actually allowed them to be characters as opposed to damsels for the most part. And it was actually
That's
quite
true.
interesting because I had them playing the damsels. It was a bit mistextual in that way because I had them playing damsels and playing damaged women just to get what they wanted and make Sin City a little bit more interesting on that front, but also kind of counterbalances. I think Nancy's done really, really well. I think Nancy's done really, really well in the film. I think her
Yeah.
breakdown's quite believable. Her drive is good, and she kind of assesses her situation, realizes where her shortcomings are, and takes steps to counteract them. And I found that really, really interesting. So it's a bit more of an intellectual play from her, which I liked. But
Yeah.
Ava, for me, kind of falls into the, she is definitely the femme fatale type. It's almost like uber femme fatale.
So I've read the original story, the A Dame to Kill For story. Whilst the film is for the most part pretty faithful, like to the narrative and kind of the spirit as well, there were some changes that I did notice. Like that I had a bit of a problem with, but I won't really get into them now, just because I think they're a bit nitpicky. This one, they do slightly play up more the idea that she has this like weird control over people, because even for a manipulator, the fact that these people are like falling for her is definitely something that can be more chalked up to her being like a siren or something, or her being like her being like a witch or whatever that can just get people to just do what she wants them to do, you know. But that I don't necessarily have a problem with. But there are some aspects to this film that I did find to be kind of dumb and a bit like unintentionally silly as well.
I want to talk about the look of this film. And while
Okay,
it's
yeah.
largely consistent with Sin City, I think it's worse overall,
Hmm.
especially with the CGI car chases and things like that. They were clearly trying to step it up a little bit on the action department and stepping a little bit more away from the mood as such. But the problem that they had in this film, it just didn't feel believable visually. It's like the whites were a little bit too bright compared to the last one for me,
Hmm.
and the way that things moved, it looked unreal rather than surreal for me.
I noticed the differences definitely. And I mean, really, I'm not sure why that would be. I think it could just be either different cinematographer, or maybe I think that they wanted to like kind of update it a bit. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mind the look that much. On a technical level, I did have some kind of problems with like some of the. Well, I don't even know if you'd call this technical, but I did have problems with some of the makeup. I had a problem with the way that Marv looked in this film.
Yeah,
He looked very, very it like in the first one, makeup that was used to transform Mickey Rourke into Marv was like seamless. You know, it was completely seamless. But in this one, it looked a bit more. It looked a lot weirder. It looked like it was. I'm wondering if they just like made the makeup process a lot more aggressive, or if they did it less, because it looked very, very different to me. You know, his face looked very different to how it did in the first film.
I think the makeup was less considerable in this one.
Yeah. Oh, and the same goes for. So in the Dwight storyline, what they're leading up to basically is like, since it's a prequel to the first one, and he doesn't look like how he does in the first film. The entire point of the story is leading up to like when he changes his appearance. So for anybody who hasn't seen this film, basically what happens with Dwight is his ex girlfriend Ava. She basically manipulates him into killing her current husband, and then what she does is like she shoots Dwight several times, and in the process ends up like damaging his face. And then what happens is like Dwight gets away, and then a situation comes about where he basically has to get plastic surgery to look different, so therefore he can then like kind of worm his way into confronting Ava again. And this makeup, it's supposed to make him look like how he did in the first film. But the thing is that although his face does look different, it doesn't really look anything like how Clive Owen did in the first film. Like his hair is on point, but his actual face, it looks different, but not quite the same as Owen's. And his voice also still doesn't really sound like Owen's. Like Clive Owen had a much like softer sounding voice, whereas Brolin all throughout is doing his usual like baritone, badass, gravelly voice, you know. So that is also kind of a distraction too.
I think Clive Owen's version of Dwight had this softer spoken mindset to him, and I think one of my biggest problems with Dwight's storyline is there's this constant insistence of oh, I can't let this get off of my head, I can't let this get out. Except that kind of struggle with the monster wasn't ever explored in the original.
This is a prequel, so I guess you can imagine in the first film, like by that point, he's become a good guy, or something like that.
Well, no, true, no, true, but I think that's the kind of struggle. The way he was talking about it, the way he was phrasing it, I don't think that's the kind of struggle that really ever goes away, especially when
Okay.
he was in the situation again. And I think I don't know. He felt like a much more wild character and less calculated in this film. And I guess that he could have developed, but we didn't see enough of that development at the end for it to land for me.
All we can guess maybe is that like after Ava betrayed him, then maybe that personality went away or something. Like I can maybe buy him thinking to himself like, oh my god, I got like manipulated into like killing an innocent man, so maybe I don't want to. So forever he'd associate his I don't know, his violent ways with that. So I don't think it's too unbelievable. I do sort of get what you mean. I do think that it's a bit like it's not quite clear, vague.
Which isn't too much of an issue, but it's enough of one that I find myself thinking about it.
Because in terms of time, we don't know how long the first Sin City film takes place after this one.
One thing that I found really, really weird is that Marv was going, Marv was there, helping Nancy go after Rourke. And from my impression from the original, he should have been dead at this point.
So I didn't notice that on viewing, but I saw some people point it out, and I was wondering. I wasn't going to point it out because but it's good that you pointed it out. Yeah, I agree. No, I agree with that. But I do think that what I would say that flaw speaks to, what I would say that kind of continuity error speaks to more. It speaks to a couple of things, but what I think it speaks to more is that another kind of miscalculation they made is that I don't think that Marv is really the same character that he is in the first film, and I think the reason why he's not the same character is because I think that the Rodriguez kind of and Miller as well, like they both knew that Marv was a very very popular character, so they wanted to incorporate him way more into this film. Like he's in practically every story aside from the Gambler one, and he even gets like the first story as well. So it's that from the beginning is a sign that they're using him way more. In general, I felt with the writing from the Marv character is that he didn't really feel like how he felt in the first film. In this one, he felt more like everyone's best buddy that they could go to for help and that would gladly help them. Even at the beginning, he's shown like attacking some
Frat boys
people who were
burning
setting
them.
homeless people on fire. So
He feels like more of a hero in this one. In the
yeah,
original, you got the idea that he didn't want to be a bad man, but you also didn't get the idea that he was particularly good either. He was kind of like this. I mean, he felt more like a force of nature than a man in the original one. In this one, that very more human side of him comes out,
yeah.
and I think it feels a bit jarring because it's not presented in the same way that his humanity is in the first one. Like he's very a clearly caring character, but it's always hidden underneath this sort of graphicness. And it's around the same time as the original Sin City because it
Mhm.
has to be. So that it's not. It doesn't make sense to me that he wouldn't be that way.
In the original A Dame to Kill For story, he does help out Dwight. So it is, and based on a brief bit that you see in the first film, I think it is somewhat believable that him and Dwight would be friends.
Yeah,
But
no, that makes sense. And I mean, he's quite protective of Nancy as well. And
yeah,
in the Dwight story, he's pretty savage. Although he seems to enjoy it more in this film than he does in the last one. Oddly, I know I just said he seems more like a hero, but he also seems to enjoy what he does a bit more. Like in the original, it was more like kind of grim resolve, and he did enjoy it in the original. It was less about the violence than the killing itself, and more about him getting close to what he wanted. And I think
well, the way that I view like the Marv character in terms of like his morality is that he's kind of like the way that he is that if you don't screw with him, he'll be your friend. Like as long as you just don't fuck with him, he'll gladly be polite to you or whatever. But if you insult him, if you attack him, if you try and hurt him, then he'll unleash it and like just kill you. So to some degree, he was a bit more of I wouldn't say call him like selfish, but in the first film, in his storyline, he was definitely very like obsessed with like self-preservation and his own goals. But again, this film is much more like he is much more of a like again like everyone's buddy or everyone's like muscle, that will yeah. So it does feel yeah. It's not an entirely unbelievable character shift, but it does feel very weird as you're watching it. You do think to yourself like were they just doing this just because Marv was a popular character, because they wanted to like kind of soften him up. It could have been that.
Could have been a way to stop him, but I don't think he needed softening, especially in the world that Sin City is, which
Hmm.
is a very not nice place, and it's full of people who are trying to do good are kind of inherently swept up in the violence of the place. And I think Marv was almost the perfect representation of that. Someone who wanted to do good things, but through the way that he was and the way that his life went and the way that his environment was, he was a violent thug, and I think it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but like, but yeah, but anyway, so another. Okay, all right. So there's one aspect that I kind of wanted to talk about, and that's the tone. Because so the tone in the first film, I felt was very consistent and very well executed. Like it was definitely a very like. It was definitely very like silly. It was definitely very absurd in a few places, but for the most part, you could take it seriously. But this film, unfortunately, I found myself laughing in scenes that I wasn't supposed to, and I just want to hone in on the main aspect that made me just like it just cracked me up every time it appeared on screen. Ghost Hardican. Oh my god, that was so terrible. It would be one thing if he was just Nancy's. I wouldn't say conscience, but but it would Nancy was just
His
kind of him.
imagination. Yeah.
But it's basically shown that he's a literal ghost. Like ghosts literally exist in Sin City.
And it was really weird because he showed up in the background of Rourke's mirror, and it was like, and you kind of, and up until that point, I had just assumed that he was a figment of Nancy's imagination, so it was fine,
Yeah.
whatever. But then I kind of saw that, and I was like, wait, what? And then if I don't know, and I didn't even consider the fact he was a ghost until you mentioned it. So I thought somehow Nancy's imagination had affected Rourke's imagination, and I kind of sat there and went,
The way that I kind of knew that he was a ghost was like one, he had his own like internal monologue, and if you were hallucinating someone, would you really? I I don't know. I mean, well, I mean, you could come up with reasons as to why they'd have a like your imaginary memory of somebody would have an internal monologue, but it was also just because like he was kind of like he felt like a separate entity. He felt like it didn't feel like it was just Nancy imagining him. He felt like his own entity. But the big problem I have, it just made Nancy's like kind of downfall. It made it very, very hard to take seriously. It made it, and like I think that they could have gotten across what they were trying to get across in a way that wasn't just so like absurd and like bizarre. What it kind of reminded me of is it reminded me of like in Amazing Spider-Man 2 when you had like the ghost of Captain Stacy who was just like constantly appearing to Peter Parker and just kind of grimly looking at him. It was I don't know if it's better or worse than that.
well, I would say it's worse because at least in that one, it genuinely was a figment of Peter's imagination that his guilt was just making
Yeah,
him see everywhere. And it's
yeah,
not often that I defend the Amazing Spider-Man 2, but
yeah,
you know, that moment wasn't the worst thing about that film, and it
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
makes sense. It's Peter's actions in response to it that then don't make sense and make it suck. But
yeah.
in this film, it's not quite the same, and it was a figment of Nancy's imagination right up until the end. And I think if that moment in the mirror with Rourke hadn't happened,
Hmm.
that element would have been a lot more tolerable.
At the very least, you could have said like it could have been up for interpretation, but the end kind of removes all interpretation. But yeah, and again, I think it just like yeah, in the first film, Jackie Boy did seem to be alive after being clearly killed, and there was that element, but again, there was a bit of interpretation. Like, is Dwight just imagining him, is he actually, or is he actually still somehow alive? But yeah, and it wasn't as like just like goofy and weird, and I don't know, and there were just a few other like brief minor scenes that I just found hilarious. Like in particular, like the bit, like probably the most like noteworthy bit is that in the final story, Senator Rourke, he has a photo of his son, and it's his son when he was the yellow bastard. And
Yeah.
that was really really bizarre. Like I know it would be the most recent photo of him, but why would you keep around a photo of your son when he looks like that? Why wouldn't you keep a photo of your son when he just looks like a normal person?
Well, I think especially because obviously he's quite clearly ashamed of his son ever ending up like that. It doesn't make sense for Rourke to have that picture on his because it makes far more sense for him to have the original picture. And I know the actual reason is because they didn't think that far ahead. But
I'm sure that that was just like a steal from the first film,
yeah,
or something, or just like a publicity photo or something, But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it could, and and the only time you saw him looking just like a regular person was just in that bit on the pier in the first film. He did appear more in his yellow bastard state.
yeah.
I agree, especially the appearing in the mirror at the end. That was ridiculous. It's just stuff like that that does just sort of indicate that like it wasn't. I'm not going to say that Rodriguez like phoned it in this time around. I don't think that he phoned it in. If anything, you can kind of tell that he was really really straining to make a sequel to Sin City, because you can see in like the amount of like recastings that they do, and what else, like even the fact that he just goes so far back to the same style. So I wouldn't call it phoned in, because I do think that he was clearly trying. I do wonder if in the process he sort of was like losing sight of what made the first film work.
They acknowledged that the visual style made it work, but I think they took away from that. I don't think the misery was balanced out as well in this film. It felt a little bit too unrealistic because of the tone and the rest of it.
I guess you could say maybe the end of the Long Bad Night, because at the end of it, obviously Johnny gets killed despite winning. That ending felt very in line with the first film, but the other stories as well essentially end with the good guy winning. Like in A Dame to Kill For, Dwight kills Ava at the end of the final story, like Nancy's Last Dance, I think it's called. At the end of it, she just kills Senator Rourke, and that's it.
The problem with the happy endings in this one, I mean, other than the gambler's story, which ends very, very tragically, is that unlike the happy endings in the first one, they're not balanced and measured like they are at first.
Like, I wouldn't say that any of the stories have particularly like satisfying endings either. And I do feel like if they had gone more for the idea of like being kind of intentionally unsatisfying, in the same way that some of the stories in the first film were intentionally unsatisfying, like in the first film, Marv gets like blamed for everything and like executed, so he did lose, but he also did win at the same time. Or even Hartigan, who kills himself, but Nancy's like still alive, safe.
Without a loss, yeah. I think that's the thing about the first one. It was very much a push and pull. It felt balanced in a way that they achieve their goals, but they lose personally. I mean, the only one that felt like that was the gambler's story.
Yeah, because he ruined Rourke's reputation, but even then, it's like again, it does feel like a bit of a hollow victory.
Yeah, but the hollow victory was the whole point of Sin City. That was good. But when Nancy did it, it was just victory. And with Dwight, Ava wasn't likable enough for it to be considered hollow, and I didn't buy their relationship enough.
She was just a pure villain, and he was defeating a villain, and if anything, it was a good thing that he killed her. It wasn't like they had a tragic love story that ended with her turning evil or anything. It was like she was just evil all the time, and he at the end of it took like just kills her, and then that's kind of a good thing, at least in my opinion. Like I also want to touch on as well, like so in the first film, I do feel like those hitmen bookending scenes quite worked, because it tied the story together. It prevented the stories themselves from feeling too disparate. It wrapped it up in a package.
It was a great, it was a great hook for the first one, and the last one gave us closure for something in an earlier story that we didn't have closure for.
But this film, unfortunately, it lacks anything like that, because it opens with like Marv. It's called Just Another Saturday Night, and that is basically what it is for Marv. It's just another instance where he finds some people, beats them up, whatever. And that would have been fine. The big problem, and this is easily the worst aspect of the film by far, like the film literally I can't even say it ends, it just stops. It, like the final story with Nancy, it does have what you could consider like a climax with her like storming the mansion, and then she kills Rourke, and then it just like cuts to black, has a couple of lines from her, and then the end credits. Like there's no like epilogue, there's no wrap up.
Almost like a climax without any resolution.
I'm wondering why they ended it like that, and a part of me wonders if it's just because they couldn't think of anything to include afterwards. I feel like they just kind of said, all right, whatever. She's won.
I think what would have been interesting if after she's won, just seeing the effects on her, like, does she go back to the strip club or not? Does it break her? Does it not? How does she, how does she respond to it? Does it change anything?
Does she become like a lunatic? Because I mean, she was already showing signs of becoming one. But if there was any kind of an epilogue or an ending to put in, that would be it, or even like something that would have brought the Hartigan story like full circle with like maybe, I don't know, she kills herself too. Like that would have been a very like tragic ending. But
how the hell she ends up in the apartment where Marv comes to see her would have been nice too, because that has to happen after this happened. It does actually make the first one a bit weirder, because why wouldn't the Cardinal mention that his senator son had been shot in the head? Because that had to take place after this happened.
And another thing I noticed as well, and this is probably more minor, but Nancy didn't look the same that she did in the first film. In the first film, she had a very specific appearance, but in the sequel, her like it was mainly her hair. Her hair looked very, very different in this one. I'd say that that's a bit more forgivable, but that could have easily been remedied by just removing Marv from the Nancy storyline. It especially kind of felt a bit redundant because he had already been in the Dwight story helping out Dwight. So he didn't need to once again be helping somebody storm a mansion, because he's already done that. And also I noticed that there's like 3 scenes in this film where people storm mansions as well. It's like you had 2 in A Dame to Kill For, and you had 1 in the final story. I agree that continuity error would have been fixed if they just removed Marv. The one thing I do actually have to say though about the Nancy storyline, and this is very, very shocking to me, is that and let's like touch upon the acting a bit. Like Jessica Alba's acting was actually legitimately good. Her acting as Nancy during like when it was showing her breakdown was actually convincing. Like actually, it was very good.
Well, the thing is, I think Jessica Alba can be a really good actress. It's just she's not often directed very well. Because have you heard her talking about the second Fantastic Four film before?
I know that she doesn't like those films that much. She felt like she was too like sexualized.
Well, I think I mean, for the second one, I can't remember if it was a director. I'm pretty sure it was a director, but literally said to her, "Oh, can you cry prettier?" And she went, "I'm sorry."
Oh yeah.
And it was no, cry pretty, Jessica. That's what they want to see. It's almost that sort of thing. I feel like when the director can stop noticing how attractive she is throughout 5 seconds, that's when you get a good performance out of Jessica Alba, because she actually has something to support her and work with her, because she's a talented actress. She's been good in films before, but I think the problem is those films are not the high publicized ones. I think the problem is she's very much got very pushed into like kind of the Hollywood leading lady type for quite a bit, and almost was often directed to have the worst aspects of that all at once. And I think it's the same reason why, if I watch a Vin Diesel film, I know I'm going to be mildly entertained, but I know I'm not. I don't go into it expecting amazing acting. I expect mumble grabs.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's actually one good thing about this film that it gave her the chance to actually just
to act. And act very well. Actually, surprisingly, it did. Like I noticed that some people like online said that acting wasn't that good in this film, and I totally disagree. I thought her acting was actually it's a bit hampered by the fact that the writing just isn't that convincing. But I do feel like in those moments where it does show her, like, her acting out her kind of breakdown that Nancy goes on, again, she actually does sell it. She actually does convince, I feel. Um,
I think it's one of the film's better performances.
I thought that the acting, for the most part, was as strong as the first film. Like I think again, certain performances are a bit stronger. Like to give, so obviously it says Albert, but there's also like I think that Powers Booth does really well with like a more expanded role in this one. He's actually very, very like menacing and very like intimidating. Mickey Rourke is still good as Marv. He's not as good. He was a lot better in the first film because he had more to do, but he still does a decent job as Marv. Brolin, I thought was like fine. I thought he was serviceable. I didn't think he was amazing. Like
Yeah,
I like he was kind of just doing his thing, but he was good.
he's kind of on his normal good, but the writing doesn't support him being better.
In the Dwight storyline as well. So they recasted Manu. They got like Dennis Haysbert from like 24 or something, and I thought that he kind of paled in comparison to Michael Clarke Duncan because Duncan was just so naturally intimidating. And even though they made the Manu character a bit more threatening, I didn't think that Haysbert's performance was that good. I didn't think he had much presence in the role.
To be fair, it's pretty tough to stand up to Michael Clarke Duncan
Yeah,
in that way, but he didn't feel like it. Like Michael Clarke Duncan, I always had gone, you've got no hope.
but Haysbert just felt like the regular, like just like a sheet of muscle essentially, and it's like, yeah, sure, that's intimidating, but the man himself was not projecting any menace to speak of.
They kind of played it like he died when Ava shot him.
I think in the original story that's something they kind of clarify a bit more that he isn't totally dead and was just incapacitated. I think.
It was literally just the way he fell and the way everything happened. Like that's just a traditional death shot, the God's eye over him, and I was kind of there like, why would you do it like that?
As for the other acting, I mean, I thought that Joseph Gordon-Levitt did a really excellent job. He really sold that, and it's weird because I don't normally associate with him with roles like that, but he did play that kind of that cockiness really well. Like that cockiness just felt natural. But the person who steals the show by far in a lot of different ways is easily, Eva Green as Ava. Like she chews scenery. I think she sold like the pretend damsel in distress aspect, and she also sold the evil conniving aspect as well. If anything, she definitely I felt that she like raised the material by far.
No, I was supposed to do. I was impressed with her performance.
I was also impressed with the fact that I think that there's only like 20% of scenes where she's like clothed. Like every other scene is her like completely naked. It's her like in a bath, or her like having sex, or her like just on a bed, just like naked. And it's like I don't know that many actresses who would be willing to just do that like to that level, to that excessive amount. Again, it's faithful to the original story. It was like all the scenes that she did are scenes that were in the original story. So so I have to give them credit for like being faithful in that aspect because not many movies would do that.
I think it was slightly overdone sexually in some ways, just because it was so in your face about it. I felt like its intended effect kind of weakened over time because you were just kind of like, oh, okay. I don't know. I feel like nudity and violence in film should elicit a strong effect. You shouldn't be able to go dead to them. But in this film, I was kind of dead to it.
It's the one aspect that's like more increased over the first film, but like the violence, the violence in this film to me felt a lot more toned down, and I know where that comes from. I think it comes from the Dames Kilfall story wasn't particularly violent, but even in terms of like the stuff that they did have, for the most part, it was just like the most that you got is like you got like the bit where Manu's eye gets taken out. You got the bit where Dwight's eye was bulging out of his face, and you got the bit where Johnny got his fingers broken. But those were kind of just fleeting. There wasn't a moment of violence that like really really made you like cringe like in the first one. Like there wasn't like the various scenes of people getting just punched in the face. There wasn't like the torture stuff. There wasn't the bit where there wasn't any like castration like there was in the first film. It was, and all of that stuff happened without you getting numb to it or anything. Like it still had its impact by the time it happened for the 35th time.
It kind of lost its bite, and I think the first one never stopped feeling visceral. Its violence was less apparent. It was, it wasn't quite as on top the whole time. Also, nastier than this film was. So you felt a lot more.
There was way more like torture, but in this one there was only like, I think there was only like one scene of torture, but aside from like with like again Johnny getting his fingers broken and punched in the face repeatedly, but aside from that, yeah, I mean it did. The only time that they really in any way extended it a bit was in the bit where he sees Christopher Lloyd in his cameo appearance as that doctor who like set his fingers back. Like, so with that, I think they were trying to like get a reaction out of you, but again, it's like fingers being broken. I don't think that's that like that
It's
is
not
that
quite the same as someone being punched until their heads are liquid.
I think to kind of wrap it up, this isn't what either of us would call like one of the worst like comic book sequels ever.
I'm not sure I'd even call it particularly bad. I just think it's aggressively mediocre.
Like I said, it's not even in the pantheon of like disappointing comic book sequels. I can think of way more disappointing ones, but this one, yeah, overall the worst aspect about it overall is just that it just kind of lacks what the first film had in a lot of ways. It just kind of feels like a bit of a hollow recreation of the first film, but it doesn't have the point. It feels muddled. It feels miscalculated. There are certain elements that just either just aren't executed well or just are hard to take seriously. It has like at its best, it's an average bit of like style over substance. I think that's what I'd call it. Like it's like cool style, some good action, good acting. It just isn't like a complete package overall.
It's got the ingredients but doesn't quite use them correctly. So it's not. I wouldn't exactly recommend the film, but I wouldn't say don't watch it either.
If you watch the first film and you're hungry for more, then it probably is worth watching in that regard. But it's not really like a necessity or anything. It doesn't like in terms of films that are like part of a franchise or films that are part of a series. There are some films that I wouldn't consider to be that good or would even consider to be bad, but that I would still say were kind of necessary parts of the story. But this one, I don't really think is necessary enough. Again, unless you really want to see what Dwight was doing beforehand or see what Nancy did afterwards, aside from that, it doesn't quite justify its own existence in that regard. As for what we're going to discuss on the next episode, do you have any suggestions for that, Jack?
I think it might be time for our Dracula week. Horror of Dracula, also known as Dracula over here, which is the Christopher Lee version, and the Bela Lugosi version.
Okay, so yeah, you want to do a comparison between both of them? Yeah, I haven't seen either of them, so this will be new for me. But
I've seen both of them multiple times. They are fantastic.
Yeah. So that will be the next episode, and then next week we'll have a choice for the week afterwards. Yeah, good. Okay.
Can't wait to have that discussion.
Yeah, great. So yeah.